Deputy Director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and I've also been helping organize our Perloff Lecture Series, which is a year-long series in which we are celebrating 100 years of transportation research at UCLA. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement and the role of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as their traditional land caretakers of the area that surrounds us at UCLA. And we'll be learning more about that later. And that funding for this series is provided by the Harvey S. Perloff Endowment. So we are the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and we are celebrating a legacy of transportation research and education at UCLA that started in October of 1925 with the establishment of a Bureau on Street Traffic Research at the University of California's Southern Branch, which is on Vermont, where LA City College is currently. And so that institution eventually moved to Westwood and became known as UCLA. So throughout the Institute's history, the types of research, the content, the focus has included all aspects of transportation: traffic safety, environmental issues, transportation engineering, social and behavioral impact aspects of travel, and policy and planning. And then we are now firmly a part of a multidisciplinary, multi-campus statewide research consortium, which is the largest transportation research consortium in the world that we're aware of. I imagine there's one that's bigger, but we just haven't looked inside China. And one of the things we're doing in for this year is standing up a UCLA Center for Parking Policy and seeking to name activities of that center after the late Professor Donald Shoup, a pioneer in parking policy. And so we are raising money for that. And so if you're so inclined, you can find information here about that campaign. So this fall, we have been looking at LA's transportation past. In the winter, it'll be our transportation present in LA, and then the future in the spring quarter. And so today's speaker is Adonia Lugo, who is a researcher at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, somebody that we brought in to fill a role about three and a half years ago. And what we have always been concerned about at UCLA is the people aspects of transportation, not just the things that go and where they go, but also how it impacts people's lives. And so one of the great things about Adonia Lugo is that she comes with that perspective from cultural anthropology of like how people build systems around different interactions and infrastructure and place. And so that perspective has been, I think, really helpful for our institute as it has grown and taken on new challenges. And I am really looking forward to Adonia's talk on indigenous transportation knowledge in Los Angeles. So Adonia, would you like to come up?
Now it's on. Thank you, Juan. Much appreciated to get that opening, and appreciate getting to be colleagues at ITS. Now, can you all still hear me if I stand at a more comfortable height? Okay, I don't have to be down like this. Okay, good. Thank you. So I am going to be advancing two sets of slides because my speaker notes are on my computer and the presentation you all are seeing is up here. So if I forget to advance, feel free to say, we don't see that slide, if I'm talking about something that's clearly not up there. So just to let folks know. But, you know, as Juan said, I'm Adonia Lugo. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm based here at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. And I am going to speak about re-indigenizing Los Angeles's transportation systems. So what does that mean? Well, I really appreciate our research center here for sponsoring this research project and for being game to go along with a kind of thought project. So when we started talking about 100 years of research on transportation at UCLA, I thought 100 years is a long time, and we treat that like it's a really long time here in LA, right? Like we often talk about LA history as though it only begins around 1900. But the reality is that people have been living in this region for thousands of years. So I brought up the idea, okay, well, cool, 100 years. What if we thought further back? What has transportation been like in Los Angeles for a longer stretch of time? And what can we learn from that? So what can we, who are transportation thinkers and doers, learn from the ways that Tongva and other local indigenous groups got around this region for thousands of years before colonial contact? So that was the starting point for this research project. And one of the reasons why I got onto this track was a number of years ago, I started this thought project with a number of other folks called the Untokening. And the Untokening was looking for, what is it that we are missing in sustainable transportation, right? Like so many of us want to see our cities shifting to more sustainable ways of moving around, get people to change their behavior, all that kind of stuff. And we were feeling like we didn't see the progress we wanted to see. So in 2016, this group of us came together and came up with this concept of mobility justice to define, what's the other stuff that's going on that might impact why people feel safer traveling in cars, or why they might be thinking that, sustainable transportation, biking, walking, using transit isn't for them. And so we came up with this Principles of Mobility Justice document, and you can find it online easily. You just go to untokening.org. And what we were hoping to kind of encapsulate in this framework of mobility justice was, that when we bump up against the stuff that seems outside of transportation in the space of transportation practice, how could we actually bring it in instead of saying, well, that's not really related to transportation or transportation systems? What if we said, yeah, actually, it is related, and it does have something to do with how people travel? And so in this case, when it comes to studying Indigenous justice and Indigenous sovereignty, the principle of mobility justice that really relates to that is up on the screen here. It's seek to repair harm, not erase history. And so in this framework of mobility justice, we're trying to ensure that we acknowledge the harms that have been part of our transportation systems and do better in the future, and that we think there's something we can learn from past mistakes, as opposed to them being something shameful or something that we, just want to leave behind. Because if we don't acknowledge what missteps were taken, we're likely to just stumble in the same ways in the future. So that was 2016, when I and others started talking about this mobility justice stuff. And then in 2017, here in Southern California, I had a sort of aha moment where I realized that even though I felt comfortable working in spaces around transportation justice, environmental justice, mobility justice, I was not actually partnering with anybody in the local Indigenous community, and that was an oversight, because we actually can't talk about environmental justice without acknowledging the way that people are also part of that story. And so since that time, I have been working on doing better myself in terms of making sure that I both build relationships with Indigenous advocates and scholars, and trying to see where there's connections with the transportation work that I do. So this is kind of like preamble. Why was I like, let's think back further than 100 years around transportation in LA? So the title of the project, Re-Indigenizing Los Angeles's Transportation Systems, where was I going with that? The concept of re-indigenizing, can I see a show of hands? How many of you have heard that term? Re-indigenizing, like a little bit. How many of you have heard the term decolonizing? Yeah, like that's much more commonly known. Well, a few years ago, I heard some critiques of the term decolonizing that said, you know, when we're always using that idea, it kind of puts things in the negative, right? And it points to what needs to be undone, and there's less of a focus on growth and bringing old things back and reviving things. And so, so I like using this term re-indigenizing as opposed to decolonizing. And so, what I was thinking of is, you know, being indigenous to a place means carrying traditional ecological knowledge. And what that is, it's abbreviated TEK often, is the understanding of systems, living systems or environmental systems, the, you know, systems of a place through many generations of observation. So people who live in relationship with a landscape for a really long time, they know a lot about it. They know its patterns, they know what works, they know what doesn't work. And so we shorthand that now as traditional ecological knowledge. And so to my mind, I was like, you know, as I just said, re-indigenizing is this alternative to decolonizing. It frames action as constructive rather than deconstructive. It means awakening relationships between people and the landscapes we live in. So, you know, I was like, I got it right. I've learned enough that, you know, I know the right term to use. And the image I have up here on the slide is from here on campus. It's Judith Baca's mural, La Memoria de la Tierra, UCLA. It's over on Ackerman Union. Beautiful mural, and at the center is a Tongva woman named Toipuriña, who was a resistance leader during the Spanish colonial era. And also featured in the mural are all kinds of social justice and racial justice movement leaders. And so to me, I was kind of like, yeah, you know, this project, I'm wanting to center Indigenous perspectives, and we're all trying to figure this out together. And as I started talking to some local Indigenous folks who agreed to be interviewed for my project, that pretty picture came apart a little bit, right? And it was more like, there are many pieces of the puzzle that we haven't put together yet. So this visual is that same image of the mural, but turned into puzzle pieces. And the things that they had to say about the concept of re-indigenizing were, there's so much to do. The scale of the work feels overwhelming. It means co-managing and caring for the land, bringing back relationships. Decolonizing is needed because we've been occupied for hundreds of years. Our people are scientists. There's a whole system of knowledge. Integrating Indigenous values and perspectives into what's now. Is that even possible? Re-indigenizing is for artists, not planners. Stewardship is the key for integrating local Indigenous values into infrastructure systems. So I both got confirmation that, you know, I was onto something with the questions I was going to be asking in this project, but also a good challenge to this kind of, you know, neat, more inspiring picture, you know, that I had in mind. So I've often encountered that when I'm doing work with people from local Indigenous communities. I myself am not Tongva or, you know, descended from any of the people who are Indigenous to this region. And so I try to, you know, be respectful of the fact that I'm an interested ally and I'm showing up in the space, but trying not to speak over others. So just wanted to note that re-indigenizing, I still value it as a concept, but it's a little more complicated. So before we get into what that stewardship for infrastructure systems could be, I want to do just a little bit of California Native American Tribes 101 for those who may not be familiar with the history of our state and its relationship with Indigenous communities. I'm assuming some of you in the room are like me and grew up in California and did a mission project at some point in elementary school. Yeah, so we get, you know, we get some facts about what happened here before we all showed up, but you probably know by now that there's some distortion and we haven't really settled on how to tell the history in in a way that really centers the experiences of Indigenous communities. But this is a really useful map. It was created by a Chumash artist named Tima Lota Link, and it's easy to find online. And what it shows is how many different groups there were living in this place that we now call California. So this was a place with tremendous language diversity, cultural diversity. People in this part of the world, really believe that language is a powerful thing, that it calls a world into being. And so today there's a lot of focus on Indigenous language revival and being stewards of the languages. And I've got a couple quotes up here from Kat M. Anderson's book, Tending the Wild, which is a really great introduction to traditional ecological knowledge in California, and just the story of both the harms and the repairing that people are doing around Indigenous knowledge. But some of the things she says about California are, this was a really diverse socio-political landscape. The kind of language that we use to shorthand that stuff now, like tribes or giving, a bunch of people one kind of common name, that wasn't necessarily how people thought of themselves or how they lived in pre-colonial times. And something that's really important to understand is that the concept of California as unspoiled, raw, uninhabited nature, as wilderness, erased the Indigenous cultures and their histories from the land. So one of the important legacies of, California's profile as this, conservation-oriented state, this environmentalist-oriented state, is there's this dichotomy that was imported here where you have people and then you have nature, and people live in, our towns and cities, and we want to have a lot of nature that's preserved for us to go and do, hiking and camping and recreational stuff in. But those two things are separate. That's not actually how people lived in California prior to colonization. They had ways of relating to the landscape that really just didn't fit into that sort of dichotomy. And I remember learning that the people in this region were hunter-gatherers, which, as a term, to me conjures an idea of people who aren't really planning ahead, right? It's almost like they're just reacting to the environment. And actually, in California, there is a very sophisticated way that people made sure to be managing their resources so that they would be able to draw on food sources and, sources of fuel, stuff like that in the future. And so something that was shared across all the diversity of Indigenous life in California was a worldview that said plants, animals, and elements are all relatives. So it's not like people and nature, it's like people are part of this system that includes all living and even non-living, as we would consider them, pieces of the landscape. And so that meant doing actually a lot of tending the wild. That's why that book has that title, is that people were actually doing, different kinds of practices with fire and water and other kinds of land management techniques to encourage the growth of plants that were useful to them and discourage the growth of plants that weren't as useful. And something that's really key in this worldview is that relatives should be respected and not exploited, right? So if you're relating to the world around you as something that's full of kin or full of people who you have relationships of reciprocity with, it changes that's a different way of approaching resources than the one that we currently have in our society. And so today, the most prominent example of how fundamentally different the land management practices of Indigenous groups were versus the leave wilderness alone policies that American settlers brought is around fire. So how many of you have heard of the concept of cultural burning? Yeah, so that's getting, it's getting out there more. More people are aware that actually, prior to colonization, a lot of indigenous groups did intentionally burn things. They would do small fires to, again, promote the growth of plants they wanted, manage the landscape. And so this image up here, which comes from a University of California report, shows how in 1872 in Yosemite Valley, even though by then it had been decades since the Ahwahnee people's land management there had been disrupted, the valley floor was still pretty clear. Versus in 2020, at least to my eyes, more familiar view of Yosemite is it's full of trees. So we have a lot of kind of re-educating or better understanding to do in California to really get a perspective on how were people shaping the landscape here? What did we people who moved here who brought a sort of Edenic view of wilderness and nature, and then applied that to the landscapes they were looking at, how were they actually erasing human beings and the labor of human beings from that landscape? And so our expectations of what nature looks like in California are a little distorted. So here in Los Angeles County, this is our county seal, which actually has a Tongva woman on it. This is the land acknowledgement for LA County that I've put on the slide here. And there's two things I want to point out. One is they name the people whose ancestral territory LA County is on. So that's the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash peoples. And then they also, down lower, name the tribal governments who they have formal relationships with. The Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, the Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians Quiche Nation, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and the San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. And I think that reflects the diversity that we have even just within LA County among our local indigenous communities. People did not, in pre-colonial times, they didn't all think of themselves as Tongva, right? And so what we have today are people who are the descendants of particular family lineages. And so some of them are organized around, like this name for their lineage. Some people are organized around this name for their lineage. And it's good to be as familiar as possible with the complexity. So this is an image from a map that has always been a work in progress that I've seen, many people share over the years. I have the name of the author on a later slide, not on this one, but this is the Los Angeles Basin. And as you can see, there were a lot of people living here. There were, I think the estimate is something around 30,000 people. And they had a lot of names for the places that they lived in and spent time. And then a lot of things changed. So Spanish settlement in California started in 1769. And I am not going to talk much here about just what kinds of changes occurred. I just want to point to the scale of disruption and change that our local indigenous communities went through. There's a really good Tongva created history timeline at this site that I have up on the slide, tobevisible.org/timeline. It's a good place to get Tongva perspectives on their history over the years. But something that I didn't really grasp until more recently, right? Like having grown up in Southern California and hearing, about the missions and getting a more like dark perspective on that as I got older. I didn't really understand how fundamentally the environment here had changed, right? It was kind of like the people changed and the buildings changed, but the plants and animals were the same. And actually, that's not even true. Like our plant and animal systems are fundamentally different now than they were prior to colonization. So everything from where people could live, to what kind of plants grew, to what animals grazed, to the waterways, all of this stuff changed through settler colonization. And there was near total dispossession for Indigenous people through slavery, violence, and at best assimilationist and at worst genocidal policies that were enacted by the state and more local government bodies. But California Native American tribes survived, adapting as they had learned to do over millennia. Something that really stood out to me when I was getting ready for this presentation and kind of thinking about, how to set up the context of Indigenous communities in California is just that story of adaptation. And adaptation is something we talk about a lot in sustainability as this, necessary activity that we need to be going through to get to more sustainable systems. And I really think that our Indigenous communities are a fabulous example of, folks who figured out how to be adaptable. So today, Los Angeles is a hub of Native life. It is a place where we actually have the largest urban Indian population in the country. We have people who are tribal members from other US tribes. We have Indigenous people from Latin America. And then there are our local Indigenous communities as well. But there's something really important that hasn't happened here, which is none of our local Indigenous communities have ever been granted federal recognition. And what that means is they don't have access to federal resources for tribes. They don't have a land base or a reservation. And so they're still struggling with the ongoing effects of erasure. And all of us have a role to play in shifting how we conceive of Native here. So this is an image from a recent event that was put on by Supervisor Holly Mitchell's office. She has this series called the Racial Justice Learning Exchange. And this past Saturday, they had this cool panel on healing through Indigenous and Native American perspectives. And this stood out to me because you see all those different communities represented here. We have Gabriela Lassos up in the left corner. She is Tongva. I've had the pleasure of working with her on a research project. Then you have other folks who are part of the urban Indian community with roots to the Navajo tribe and other places. And then you have somebody who works with Cielo, which is a group that supports Indigenous communities from Latin America who call LA home as well. So this place is like so full. I feel like LA doesn't really have that reputation of being a hub of urban Indian life, but it really is. So I encourage you all to learn more about that. Okay, so how did people get around here before colonization? So before 1769, when Spanish settlement got going in California, what were the transportation systems and patterns? And first, I want to do a big thank you to the Tongva folks who agreed to be interviewed for this project. I spoke with Tina Calderon, a longtime collaborator of mine who is Gabrielino Tongva and Chumash and works as a culture bearer just tirelessly. I bet some of you have been to events where she's been, involved. And Anne-Marie Mendoza, who is a Tongva community member and a planning scholar who is about to be a UCLA PhD. They both just do amazing work in awakening traditions and educating non-natives about their ancestral territory here. And I really appreciate them having some good conversations with me for this project. So what they told me about transportation systems here prior to colonization was it's all about water. Water was everywhere, right? People needed to live near water because they needed to drink it. But they also used waterways for traveling. They knew that water was dynamic and changing. This is a region where we have floods that are sometimes unpredictable. And so both Tina and Annie talked about the way that people would, know how to respect the water, stay out of the way. And so instead of expecting waterways to kind of hold still and stay in one place, people here expected to have to move because the water might be moving. And so that really stood out to me. And my conversations with them was, what did we expect to be mobile, right? Like these days, we expect our rivers and creeks to stay in one place, and our homes to stay in one place. And then we, as people, just kind of circulate. But the way that people were living here in pre-colonial times was more based around the landscape itself shifting and being willing to move. Annie is also a filmmaker and directed a documentary called The Aqueduct Between Us. It's on YouTube. Yeah, this guy knows what I'm talking about. I'm getting great nods from him. It's a really good illustration of the clash between how people lived in this region before the colonial era and the ways that they're trying to kind of like find more of a connection to traditional life now. And it's also about how we bring water down here from other indigenous land in the state because we've done such a poor job of kind of managing our relationship to water locally. So water was everywhere in pre-colonial times. And water was sacred. So the way that people related to the rivers in this region, there were 4 sacred rivers. So we now call them the Los Angeles River, the Rio Hondo, the San Gabriel River, and the Santa Ana River. And for Tongva and other local indigenous communities, those are the West River, that's what they called the LA River. The Rio Hondo was the Little River, the San Gabriel was the Rocky River, and the Santa Ana was the Long River. And these were living beings that you were careful with, right? They were sources of drinking water. And the local communities did some channelizing to do some ecosystem care, encourage the growth of things they wanted to see. But there really was not an expectation that those rivers were going to behave necessarily. And people here didn't see the water systems as theirs to control, right? It was more about being in relationship. And so this is where I've got the name of the person who made this Tongva Villages map. And as I said, I've seen this in a bunch of different forms over the years. Sutimi Pa'alat, which is some kind of pseudonym. I don't know who that person is. So some of the ways that people got around on water here were they had 2 kinds of boats. There were boats made of tule grass that people could use to navigate the rivers. So tule grass, when it's wet, swells up, and so it helped to make these boats kind of watertight. We also have a lot of asphalt or tar in this region. The name of the street La Brea and the La Brea tar pits, which if you're not aware, La Brea tar pits means the La Brea tar pits, the tar pits, because Brea means tar. So, so people would use those resources to make their boats more waterproof. People also had relationships with the islands here. So what we now call Catalina, they called Pimu, the Channel Islands up north, San Clemente Island further south. They had these boats called tiots that were made of wood that they would use to go talk to relatives and gather food out on the water. So this was really a place that had more of a watery profile than we give it credit for today. And what was travel for in the pre-colonial era? One thing I learned was that it was for marriage. So people would marry 7 villages out. So you had to be able to do some traveling. There had to be, trails and footpaths so that people could go visiting and see relatives and meet new people. And then for trade, there were longer trails that connected further territories. And, these footpaths have ironically been preserved in a way, or at least the routes of them, because they first served as Spanish expedition trails and then became today's roads and highways. So during my research, I was also working on a Caltrans-sponsored project that I'll mention later on. And I heard from a high-ranking cultural affairs staff there that it's common knowledge that Indigenous routes underlie the state highway system. Sepulveda Boulevard came up as an example. So we have the routes of a lot of those trails and transportation networks that we're still using today. But of course, today, the landscape is pretty different. The footpaths are freeways and the waters are captive. So, not only are the trails overlaid with concrete, the rivers are surrounded by concrete, those 4 sacred rivers, and so are the creeks that crisscross the landscape. We actually have a buried creek here at UCLA. I just learned this summer, thanks to Juan and the sustainability director for the campus, over in, is it called the Sunken Gardens, those parks over there?
Yeah, it's in front of Perloff Hall.
Yeah, in front of Perloff Hall, yeah.
Dixon.
Dixon Court, thank you. There's a creek buried there. That was actually an arroyo, and I was totally shocked to learn that. But that is not uncommon here. There are a lot of buried creeks, and there's a lot of great research on this out there if you do some digging. Someone who's very interested in both transportation and the history of water in Los Angeles is Joe Linton, who's the editor of LA Streets blog, and he's done a lot of work around the LA River and creeks in the region as well. So good stuff to learn there. But we have really, we expect the water to hold still now. We don't want the water to move, except for that water that we're bringing, without consent from other territories up north. And something else that is getting us more toward that question of how can we be good stewards is, even though there's a lot of projects in LA that aim to improve environmental quality or, restore habitat, do all kinds of, repair work and sustainability, we don't yet include by default the actual traditional stewards of the land and the waterways here. So thinking about how can we be good stewards, I really, that stood out to me. That was a comment from Annie about re-indigenizing being for artists, while planners should focus on stewardship. And I've got a few ideas for how we can be good stewards of transportation systems here. The first thing is building relationships. So I had a good conversation many years ago with Cheyenne Reynoso, who's an urban Indian scholar and land expert here in LA, where I was talking about this concept of human infrastructure that I work with. And she said, well, relationships, they're kind of the original infrastructure, right? And so if we want to really bring back the knowledge that tribes have and build more resilient futures, we need to do it in partnership with tribes and tribal members in LA. So the image here is the cover of a book called Tongva Women Inspiring the Future, which was put together by Julia Bogany, who is a now deceased Tongva elder who did a lot to bring awareness about the tribe to a broader audience. And what it means to, build those relationships and bring more of that knowledge in, it really means paying local Indigenous folks to be a meaningful part of our restoration efforts. So I've got some images up here from the Wallace Annenberg Wildlife Crossing that's currently being constructed over the 101 up by Calabasas. And this is like a fabulous project, right? They're building, a connector so that plant and animal life can, travel across this freeway. And in transportation, we're very aware of the harm that freeways have done. But it doesn't seem like on this project, they've really, in a meaningful way, brought in local Indigenous folks to also be part of what they have in mind. It's almost more about the relationship that we have with mountain lions than it is about, the way that people and animals and wildlife have been in relationship here for thousands of years. So paying people to really be in the lead around restoration is important. And a really good example of this is over in Altadena. There's this spot called the Tongva Tarahat Pahava Conservancy. And it is just this really, exciting project that got established a few years ago. It's the first Tongva-owned land in LA since colonization. And they had done a bunch of habitat restoration on this parcel of land, which is right on the edge of Eaton Canyon, prior to a big event that happened in Eaton Canyon in January. And they credit the work that they've done to restore native habitat there with protecting their parcel from the worst of the Eaton fire. But they are just like a really standout local example of how we can, in a meaningful way, forefront Indigenous knowledge in sustainability practices. And when it comes to transportation, so I do a lot of work with Caltrans, the State Department of Transportation, because I sit on the State Transportation Commission. And I am supposed to be paying a lot of attention to how we spend our transportation dollars in the state. And so I've gotten to learn a fair bit about how Caltrans relates to tribes. And, tribal transportation planning is its own field. There is a whole world out there of people who do street planning, road planning on reservations. They have national networks, a national conference, stuff like that. Caltrans has many protocols that they follow around how government agencies are supposed to interact with tribal governments. So with road construction, they end up unearthing a lot of ancestral remains and heritage objects. And so Caltrans, which is our state's divided up into 12 different Caltrans districts. They have staff at all the districts who are responsible for actually liaising with tribes and following the right procedures and all that. And all Caltrans districts, except District 7, which is Los Angeles, and District 12, which is Orange County, have someone in that role of liaising with tribes. And in District 7 and 12, it's a little different because we're the only districts in the state that don't have any federally recognized tribes. So another way that the resource impacts of the lack of federal recognition comes down for Indigenous tribes in LA is around, are they even supported to consult with government agencies around transportation. I did hear from Caltrans's Office of Equity and Tribal Affairs that they are going to be adding some staff in this area. So that's something I'm really interested in learning more about. And I also, so not wearing my commissioner hat, but wearing my ITS researcher hat, I'm just wrapping up a project with engineering professor Reagan Patterson, where we've been working on developing recommendations for Caltrans on how they could transfer more of their excess land to tribes and environmental justice groups. Because Caltrans is a big landowner in the state. And when they've completed a project or when a project has been canceled, they're supposed to get rid of the property that they own for that project. And so it's a real opportunity to, if if political will within the agency is there, they could be really trying to do more land return and land back kind of reparations work. So the image I've got up here is actually an example of that up in Caltrans District 1 on the Northern California coast in Mendocino County. They have been working to transfer an area called Blues Beach to an Indigenous-led conservancy called Kai Poma. And it is, both an example of, great reparative work around land back, but also what we learned in studying it is there's just a really onerous process at this point in time. It's not easy for tribes to get land from Caltrans. So I'll continue to be, working in that area. And next week I get to go down to UC Irvine to present on some of that work to a conference called Land Forward down there. So there already is a lot in place when it comes to how a transportation agency like Caltrans relates to tribes. But I think there's also more work to be done specifically in how do they relate to urban Indian communities? How do things go when we're not talking about tribes that have federal recognition or a reservation? And another area where I think plenty of sustainable transportation advocates can be thinking about this crossover with Indigenous justice topics is around trails. So all of those rivers and creeks that are now encased in concrete, a lot of them have multi-use trails along them already. And access to those trails has been a point of advocacy in the past. I'm on the board of an organization called Los Angeles Walks, and we're talking about, how can we take on Indigenous solidarity in more meaningful ways. And one example of this is, one of the expeditions that came through here in the late 18th century was the Anza expedition. So that was a whole bunch of soldiers and horses who were coming through, and they camped in what is now Griffith Park in January 1776. And one of the soldiers on that expedition was named Jose Vicente Feliz. He was later given the area as a land grant, which is why we now have a neighborhood called Los Feliz. I was interested to learn when I was doing this research. And the Anza Trail is a federally designated National Historic Trail, which means the staff there, who I had spoken to earlier in my research, are not officially available to speak with because of our federal government being shut down at the moment. But they have done a lot of work to create a guide to Indigenous groups that are along the trail route, figuring out how to be in dialogue with how tribes are relating to land along the trail today. So just another example of how people are making a connection between tribes and transportation systems. But really, my big takeaway from doing this research was that water and mobility systems are intertwined, both historically, here in LA, but I think there's a lot more digging to do around what is it going to mean to restore those water systems? There's a lot of people who are passionate about ecological restoration in places like the LA River. But how do we get transportation integrated in a good way? And how do we make sure that the stewards of traditional ecological knowledge are really in that work at the fore? And this picture up here is just something I really like. There was an art exhibit in 2021 put together by Tongva artist Caro Romero, and the project was called Tongva Land, and one of the pieces was a billboard on Sunset Boulevard that said Tongva Land in the style of the old Hollywood land. That's the origin of the Hollywood sign. So I do want to highlight at the end here, there is really good work in the areas of transportation, land use and Indigenous sovereignty, and water and Indigenous sovereignty from Indigenous scholars who were at UCLA. So Cheyenne Reynoso's 2022 thesis, Creating the Space to Reimagine and Rematriate Beyond a Settler Colonial Present, the Importance of Land Rematriation and Land Back for Non-Federally Recognized California Native Nations. It's available online, and I think is a really good resource if you want to learn more about Tongva Tarahat Pahava Conservancy. Cheyenne was on the staff there while she was writing this thesis and knows a lot about it. And then another piece that recently came out from the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy is called Water is Life, Water is Power. And that was co-authored by Anne Marie Mendoza and Andres F. Ramirez. So good work happening around this at UCLA. And I have come to the end of my presentation. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Adonia. So we'll have an opportunity for questions. If you have a question, please get ready to raise your hand, but I have a question to start off with. Is there anything that you learned in preparing for this project that surprised you or was just different versus your priors before you came into the project?
I feel like it should have been obvious, but I had not thought about water as this super important nexus to be paying attention to. Even though I had talked, the people I interviewed for this project are people I've been lucky to be in thought partnership with for years, and I know their work, like Annie's film, The Aqueduct Between Us, I've seen and presented many times. And somehow it wasn't till we sat down to have this conversation that I was like, oh, that was the transportation infrastructure, the water networks. So that was a new connection made in my brain.
Yeah, water seems very different now, as you mentioned. It's all infrastructure and not part of nature. Are there questions from those who are gathered? Okay, please wait for the microphone to get to you. We are broadcasting and archiving this for people online, and they'll be able to hear you if you use the mic. Go ahead.
Hello, can everybody hear me? I just had a quick question on, you mentioned like how, the waterways look very different from what they did in the past. And I'm wondering if there are any efforts going on in the LA area to restore some of these waterways, change things. My understanding, there are a lot of wetlands that are really drained along the coast too. Like, the only thing I can think of in the West Coast is like, there's like dam removal projects going up and down the Klamath River in Oregon and Washington. Is there anything like that down here? Thank you.
Well, there is, a long history of people working on habitat restoration for the LA River, definitely the Ballona wetlands.
Just gonna stop the share. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So yeah, I would say learning about those efforts is a good starting place, but I know I don't want to speak to the particular history of any one project because I haven't been like a volunteer or a member of a board of any of those groups. I just know that the general situation we have is that in the past, there's really been, an environmentalist attitude of kind of just skipping over the indigenous folks who, are also part of this land history. And so I would say that's probably more where the challenge has been. But yeah, absolutely. There are people who have dedicated their lives to, trying to move toward a better relationship with our waterways. And, the really beautiful example is up in Elysian Valley, so near the Frogtown neighborhood. There's been a lot of advocacy there to bring in more native plant species, and the river has a soft bottom. Yeah, so a lot of good stuff out there. Just how do we make sure that we, don't contribute to the erasure of the stewards?
Are there other questions?
It really resonated with me when you mentioned about planning ahead versus being reactive. More specifically, I kind of couldn't help but think about like the recent wildfires at the beginning of the year. And I'm curious, like, what would that look like as far as being reactive to that contemporary issue that happened? And it kind of ironically played into what you were talking about, wildfires as well, and also indigenous culture. I'm just curious, what would that look like instead of reacting the way we have now, and also taking note of what indigenous people have done as a great cast of an example?
Yeah, great question. I think two things. One is we have this real problem with we have this like fortress mentality, right, that we brought to the landscape here, where we're like, nothing should be able to, damage my house. Like, it's going to get through earthquakes, it's going to get through wildfires, it's going to get through floods. And that was not the attitude that people had living here for millennia, right? And so how do we face facts around just the material realities of the landscape when it comes to land use and development? That's really challenging, right? And I think, you can see with the way people have reacted to the loss of homes in the Palisades area, you know, it seems like oftentimes when people are in recovery from a disaster, there is this, you know, kind of like, we will rebuild, like having that sort of attitude, you know, is part of their way of processing the trauma. But unfortunately, you know, we've just seen over and over and over in California that building in what's called the urban wildland interface isn't a great idea, that there, you know, there will be these really major fires. But I also want to point out, for me, as someone who, you know, cares a lot about sustainability and climate adaptation and all that kind of stuff, the way that Indigenous communities in California and their allies have worked really hard to start reintegrating some of these practices into how we do things is really inspiring. So I would just highly recommend, you know, doing some research on fire mosaics and cultural burning in California. So that book I mentioned, Tending the Wild, there's also a really great PBS series based on it that has the same title, Tending the Wild. And you get to hear about like all this just really nourishing stuff around people who are gathering materials for baskets and traditional foods, or working on, you know, getting these kind of cultural burning practices in place with state agencies. So there's been a lot of progress in that area. And again, like for me, it always feels inspiring to learn about that stuff. Like we are, as much as sometimes it feels like the world is on fire, we also have a lot of smart people who are working hard to make good decisions. And this is one area where it feels good to learn about it.
Okay, back here. Either.
My question is pertaining to the pathways. A couple of years ago, there was a guest speaker that came by to my undergrad institution and was talking about this geospatial mapping project of actually being able to better understand the pathways and how they've connected with the highways. And I'm just curious if this specific GIS project has been informing the research being done here.
Good question. You know, I did not end up engaging very much with any of the historical sources on Indigenous footpaths or any of the newer GIS stuff. I did learn that at Caltrans, if you go to a Caltrans district office, you can see their cultural resources map that shows like the trails that they're aware of and stuff like that. And that's been on my to-do list, is to get over there and see that. But I didn't have a chance before this presentation. But yeah, there's a lot of good work out there based here at UCLA and at USC. I think there's, yeah, a number of institutions that are trying to bring more of that to light.
Over there.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I know you mentioned earlier that you were going to present at the Land Forward conference. Does the term land forward mean the same thing as land back, or are there like differences?
I think it's a play on words, yeah, that it's kind of like same thing, decolonizing, re-indigenizing, land back, land forward. And honestly, I had not thought about it until you mentioned that. But I'm guessing that's what they had in mind.
Okay, here we have a question over here, Roberto.
So it was really interesting to learn about the interface that tribes have with Caltrans. I was curious to know, I know you mentioned like in District 2 and Orange County that isn't, that dynamic isn't as present due to the lack of federal recognition. I was curious to know if like beyond Caltrans, if there's other collaboration with like more local jurisdictions like counties or like NPOs, and like what benefits there are to that, or like if there's certain like leverage that is like present from those interactions or those collaborations that isn't as present with like the state, which is a lot larger. So yeah, just curious to know what that interface is like with other types of jurisdictions.
That's a great question.
Adonia, can you repeat this question?
Yeah, so the question is around, so I talked about how tribes and Caltrans, some of that structure of relationship, and what's the case for MPOs or regional agencies or more local jurisdictions, right? Yeah, so here in LA, we have something called the LA City County Native American Indian Committee. And that has representation both from local indigenous tribes, but also people who are part of the broader urban Indian diaspora in the area. And largely because the tribes don't have a reservation or that federal recognition piece, it's really kind of case by case and whether an agency wants to take on being in good relationship. So I can't speak to any kind of general. I don't know. I mean, I think with all the agencies, you can probably find a land acknowledgement, but in terms of what programmatic work they have around tribal issues, yeah, I don't have a good read of that off the top of my head. But you can look into it with, obviously any government agency and find out, do they have a formal, body that is supposed to be kind of like the decision maker or audience for topics relating to tribes. And there's a lot of activity around cultural monitoring. So that's what happens when, there's a construction project and remains or cultural artifacts are unearthed. There's this law called NAGPRA, which I'm not going to be able to remember what that stands for, but it basically, it's like if an area is known to be a sensitive site, then they'll have cultural monitors from the local tribe present, or if they do uncover some remains, then that sort of triggers having cultural monitors there. I don't know what power, I'm guessing very little power the cultural monitors have. And I know there have been many, 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 past cases of remains being treated disrespectfully and, agencies or companies not following the law. So anyway, there's a lot out there. And I would definitely recommend if you're interested in a particular city or MPO, just looking at their website and seeing what they say about it.
Do we have other questions? Okay, right here. And please do ask your question into the microphone for the folks who may be joining over the web.
Got it. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is about how transportation can serve as a kind of educator and a place for education of Indigenous history. In California, I think about how like El Camino Real throughout the state is marked with historic markers and kind of recognizes the Spanish history. What can that look like, or what does that look like for Indigenous communities?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yeah, I think the impression I've gotten is that a lot of times those kinds of markers are actually more reminders, right, of the colonial violence and harm. And so I know there's an ancestor walk that people have done a few times where they follow US 101 because 101 is El Camino Real. It was the route that the Spanish colonizers used, and then a heavily used route during the Mexican era as well. And so there's still a lot of ways that our history is tangled up in mythology in California. There's a really great book called Southern California, an Island on the Land by Carrie McWilliams that was written many decades ago, but it's still, I think, really relevant in how it talks about how California turned its colonial history into like a Hollywood style performance. And so many of us here grew up with this landscape where we have the remains of the colonial era, right? Like there's old adobes and there's the missions and stuff like that. But then we also have so much stuff that's like fantasy about that era, right? So it can be really hard to separate fact from fiction. And so, you know, for some people, the missions are this like beautiful, romantic, you know, garden space where you want to host your wedding and, you know, go have a nice day out. For other people, the missions are, you know, a site of violence and, you know, a site of slavery. And so we don't have a shared view necessarily of what are the positive and negative aspects of our history in California. And so there's just a lot more work to be done in this area. But for sure, the fact that our road system, our state highway system, you know, that people are aware of the legacy and the connectedness that they have with this Indigenous history means that there's just, you know, I think a lot more reinterpretive work that could be done. And I feel like, yeah, with this project, I just barely scratched the surface.
Okay, I was wondering if you had thoughts on what the practice of transportation policy and planning might look like if there were more incorporation of Indigenous knowledges in California in these practices. Do you have thoughts on that?
I think that we would have a different way of defining what benefits we were going after. One of the things I've seen working on the California Transportation Commission is that, you know, we're a giant state, right? And I mean, it was diverse before colonization, it's diverse now. And we're not all in agreement about, you know, what we're trying to get from investments in our transportation systems. And but broadly speaking, there's a few kind of camps, right? Some people think that our transportation systems should be designed to support good, sustainable travel behavior, right? So we should be investing in transportation systems that allow people to get around with, you know, less of a carbon footprint, less time that they're spending, you know, just kind of being stuck in traffic. That ultimately, how we spend money in transportation should mean that we've got a better quality of life, and our mobility systems are contributing to that. And then there are people who think that investing in our transportation systems, all that end user stuff is great, but what they're really interested in is the money that goes into building transportation systems. So the jobs, the construction jobs that are created when we invest in big capital projects and we spend a lot of money on transportation. And the difference between those two camps is something that I've spent a lot of time observing in the last few years. And so since that's the main kind of like dynamic that I'm paying attention to with state transportation policy, I'm thinking about how would bringing more Indigenous perspectives into that shenanigans, what would it look like? And I think, I mean, one of the things that's really, as I was saying earlier, just like nourishing to me about learning more about Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and ways that people are relating to environments is that it really, for me, it's like it offers a way forward. It's like, oh, we're not just mired in the muck of our, you know, effed up society. Like if we can live in a way that is in right relationship, that's the term a lot of people in social justice spaces use. If we live in right relationship to the material environments that we're part of, and we're not just like buying stuff out of convenience, we're not just, you know, being completely removed from the context of production of the things that we're using, then if you can actually like see the material limits and feel the material limits of your environment, then that's a more, you know, satisfying way to live, right? And so one of the things that has kept me really curious and interested in Indigenous worldviews in Southern California is that it's like, oh yeah, that's what it was all about. Like people used what was around them. They knew and they shared through oral history, a broader knowledge of, what was beyond like the limits of their villages. And they moved for, specific reasons and, had ways of doing that. And the way we live now under capitalism doesn't work in as straightforward a way. It's really hard to try and have a view of like, where did my shirt come from? Where did my shoes come from? What are the resources that are going into the bus that is going to bring me to campus? All the components that are in my computer. Where's that compost bin really, going to end up? There's so many ways that we're disconnected from our material environments. And so for me, getting more, grounded in Indigenous traditions in California is like an alternative to that. So I would say in terms of applying that to state policy, I do think we have that problem as a state as well. Like when our governor says, that having more stuff coming into the Port of LA that needs to be put on trucks and taken to warehouses in the Inland Empire when, lots and lots of containers are coming in, that's the sign that our, state economy is doing well. It doesn't feel like at a more local level, living in Los Angeles, where communities have for decades fought to get more recognition of the harm that our trade system puts on their communities in terms of pollution burdens and stuff like that. It doesn't feel like that metric of success tracks super well at a more local level. So yeah, so it would be nice to have more of a sense of some kind of like material grounded limits on transportation that were incorporated into how we do transportation policy. And at this point in time, that's not how we operate.
Okay. Well, thank you, Adonia. I appreciate you sharing today. Please join me in thanking. All right. So we have I believe there are other slides. Grab this. Yes. So we have another lecture in this series of LA's Transportation Past. Next week will be Professor Brian Taylor with Fighting Traffic Congestion 100 years ago, and more recently than 100 years ago as well, because it turns out that that trend has continued. And thank you for joining us. If you really want to watch this again, share it with a friend. You can go to our YouTube channel, and it will be up there right after class today. And so we will reconvene next week. Thank you, everyone.